My name is Grace, and I built my fortune with my own two hands. For over 30 years, I lived and breathed the company I created from scratch. I poured myself into it, sacrificed sleep, pushed through setbacks, and carried the weight of every decision. And when I finally sold it for $40 million, I thought it was time to rest, to celebrate, and to share the joy with the one person I believed I had raised to stand beside me in loyalty, my only son, Josiah. I can still remember the pride that swelled in me that week. For years I had told myself, if I just keep going, Josiah will never have to struggle the way I did. Every house I bought, every car I drove, every award I accepted, it was never really just for me. It was for him, for the child I had once cradled in my arms, vowing that no matter what this world took from me, I would give him stability. I wanted him to feel secure, wanted him to inherit not just wealth, but a legacy he could carry forward. And so, when the papers were signed and the deal was done, I thought a boat cruise would be the perfect way to mark the moment. Florida skies stretched wide and bright that morning. The yacht was elegant, but not gaudy, the kind of vessel that felt like freedom, like the beginning of a new chapter. I told Josiah and his wife Lydia, this is for us, a family celebration. I meant every word. I wanted to laugh with them, to eat, to toast to our future, and to imagine what life might look like when the burdens of work no longer consumed me. As the yacht cut across the water, the air was soft and warm, carrying the faint taste of salt. I stood at the railing, letting the wind whip my hair back, thinking about how far I had come from the young woman who once worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Lydia was smiling faintly, sipping her drink, but there was something unreadable in her eyes that I pushed aside. Josiah was more talkative than usual, his hand brushing my shoulder as he said, "Come on, Mom, let's step closer to the edge. You have to see this view." I trusted him. Of course I did. This was my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, the young man I had cheered for at graduations, the man I still called my pride and joy. So I followed him without hesitation, resting my hands against the cool metal railing. The water below churned in foamy swirls, deep and endless. Josiah leaned in, his voice low enough that it was almost lost in the sound of the engine. And then it happened. The force of his hands hit me square in the back, sudden and violent. My body pitched forward before my mind could process what was happening. The world tilted, the sky vanished, and the sea opened its mouth to swallow me whole. That was the moment my celebration ended, and my fight for life began. If you're watching this right now, I want you to do something for me. Just type the number 1 in the comments. That's all. Nothing fancy. Let's see how many of you are here with me, listening as I tell you how everything I built nearly became the reason my own son tried to end me. The water hit me like a wall of stone. Cold, heavy, unforgiving. My body slammed into it with such force that the air tore from my lungs before I could even scream. Salt burned my mouth as I swallowed a mouthful, choking, thrashing, desperate for breath. For a split second, I thought maybe it had been an accident, that somehow my feet had slipped. But the sting in my back, where his hands had shoved me, told the truth my heart didn't want to face. I kicked upward, arms clawing through the waves, fighting to break the surface. When I finally burst above the waterline, gasping, I saw the yacht. Its white frame looked impossibly far, moving forward with steady speed. I screamed Josiah's name, coughed, flailed, and screamed again. The sound was swallowed by the wind and the hum of the engine. But I could see them. I could see the two of them standing there, their figures framed against the wide sky. Josiah didn't move. He didn't shout for help. He didn't throw a life ring. He just stood, frozen, or maybe resolved. Lydia was beside him, her hand wrapped around the rail. She didn't scream either. She didn't wave, didn't cry out, didn't so much as lift a finger. The silence between them carried louder than any denial could. I wasn't falling. I had been pushed, and together they were letting me drown. The waves crashed against me, pulling me down, dragging me under. Every time I rose for air, water poured into my mouth, burning my throat. My arms grew heavy, my legs trembling with exhaustion as the yacht grew smaller, until it blurred into the horizon. Panic surged like fire in my chest. My son, the child I had given everything to, had decided my death was worth more than my life. Disorientation set in quickly. The sun was a blinding glare overhead, heat pressing down while the sea smothered me from below. I couldn't tell how long I stayed afloat, only that each second stretched into eternity. My clothes clung like weights, pulling me deeper. With every kick, I clawed them loose enough to breathe, my body shaking violently from the strain. It was in those moments, gasping, spitting salt, staring at the empty stretch of horizon, that the reality settled over me, with a finality sharper than any blade. Josiah had meant for this. Lydia had allowed it. Together, they had decided that the woman who raised him, the woman who built everything he had ever enjoyed, would be left to die nameless in the sea. The betrayal cut deeper than the waves that slammed me under. And as I drifted, fighting for every breath, one thought burned hotter than fear. If I survived, their silence on that deck would be the very thing that damned them. The moment Josiah's hands left my back, I thought it was the end. The ocean swallowed me whole, thrashing me in every direction. I clawed toward the surface, spit salt water, and screamed until my throat was raw. The yacht grew smaller, the sound of its engine fading until it was just me and the water. Every kick of my legs felt heavier, every gasp shorter. My arms ached as if they no longer belonged to me. I don't know how long I fought. Minutes felt like hours. My chest burned with fire, my vision blurred with sun and salt. Just when I thought my body would finally surrender, I heard something, distant at first, then closer. A motor. Shouts in the air. I turned my head and saw a small fishing boat cutting across the waves. I tried to lift my arm, but it flopped uselessly. My cry came out as little more than a broken gasp. Still, someone must have seen me. The boat veered sharply. Strong, calloused hands reached into the water and hauled me up like I was nothing more than a net of fish. My body collapsed onto the wooden deck, trembling uncontrollably. Water poured from my lungs as I coughed and gagged. One of the fishermen pressed a bottle against my lips. The first sip stung my throat, but I swallowed anyway. Another wrapped a jacket around me, rubbing my shoulders to warm me. They took me to shore, not to a hospital, but to a modest home near the docks, where one man's wife and daughter tended to me. They laid me on a cot, spooned broth between my lips, and cleaned the salt from my skin. Day by day, strength trickled back into me. My lips healed. My voice returned. My body stopped shaking. I was alive, but I stayed there, hidden, saying nothing to the world beyond those walls. 5 days. That's how long I remained out of sight. 5 days in which my son carried on as though I had vanished forever. 5 days of silence, where he believed the ocean had buried me. But those 5 days did something more powerful than any lawyer or judge could. They gave him the illusion of victory. He thought he had succeeded. He thought his hands had erased me, and that made my return all the more devastating. While I lay hidden, regaining my strength in that modest coastal home, my son wasted no time convincing the world I was gone. Later, I would piece it together through investigators and relatives who told me how swiftly Josiah and Lydia moved. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment, as if my fall into the ocean wasn't a tragedy, but a door finally opening for them. The very day I disappeared, Josiah called my attorney. His voice was measured, calm, almost rehearsed. He explained that there had been an accident at sea, that his mother had slipped overboard. He asked what steps needed to be taken to secure the estate in the event her body was not recovered. The words were cold. There was no hesitation, no stutter, no grief. Just business. Lydia was no bystander. She sat in those meetings, nodding, her presence giving weight to his story. Together, they inquired about transferring access to my accounts, about what properties could be signed over immediately, about insurance claims that might be filed. They weren't waiting for a body. They weren't hoping for a miracle. They were preparing their future. Within 48 hours, Josiah had contacted a funeral director. He spoke of memorial services, of obituaries, of how best to honor my legacy. The very idea twisted my stomach when I learned of it later. My body had not even been declared lost, yet he was already selecting flowers and programs, presenting himself as the grieving son ready to take on the mantle of everything I had built. The family, my siblings, my cousins, were bewildered. Some whispered that it all seemed too quick, too tidy. But grief makes people accept what they don't want to question. And Josiah counted on that. He stood before them, Lydia at his side, shoulders squared, voice steady, telling them how proud I had been, how sudden the accident was, how deeply he mourned. They believed him because why wouldn't they? Who would suspect a son of planning his own mother's disappearance? Behind closed doors, though the picture was different. Investigators would later find the search history on Josiah's devices, inheritance law, death at sea protocols, time frames for declaring a missing person legally dead. Lydia's messages to a friend confirmed the speed of their plans. Things are moving faster than we thought. They weren't grieving. They were celebrating. I imagine the look on his face in those days, walking through my house, touching furniture he believed was now his, breathing air he thought I would never breathe again. I imagine Lydia watching him, proud, complicit, believing the fortune was finally theirs. 4-5 days. They lived in the comfort of stolen victory. But as I would soon remind them, what the ocean couldn't finish, I would. The 5th day after my disappearance, I was strong enough to stand on my own feet again. My body still ached from the sea, my lips were cracked, and my skin was burned from the sun, but my spirit was sharper than ever. The kindness of strangers had carried me back from death's edge, and with every swallow of broth, every sip of water, I felt my strength return. Yet I knew I could not simply walk back into town and announce that I had survived. That would give Josiah and Lydia too much room to adjust, to spin their story, to prepare their lies. No, I had to move in silence. I had to see their faces before they saw mine. I traveled back, quietly, Dressed in plain clothes, the fisherman's wife had lent me a hat pulled low, a scarf covering the marks the salt water had left on my skin. I kept to the shadows, slipping into the city as though I were a ghost haunting the very streets my money had once helped pave. Every step back into familiar ground was laced with fury and focus. My own son had tried to erase me. My daughter-in-law had stood by him, and while the world believed me gone, I would watch them revel in their arrogance before I shattered it. The first place I went was not my house, but the neighborhood church, where I had heard whispers of a memorial gathering. I stayed outside at first, across the street, where I could see the people arriving. They wore somber black, carrying casseroles, flowers, soft words of condolence. It struck me how quickly grief had been arranged, how swiftly Josiah had set the stage. He was already moving as if my story had ended. I inched closer, heart pounding in my chest, until I saw them. Josiah and Lydia stood near the entrance, greeting mourners with the kind of poise that would have fooled anyone who didn't know better. His shoulders were squared, his head held high, his arm wrapped firmly around his wife's waist. He played the part of a grieving son perfectly, down to the faint glisten in his eyes, a performance so convincing I almost would have believed it myself if I hadn't known the truth. Lydia clutched his arm, her expression measured, as though she had rehearsed every nod, every sigh. The pair of them looked like a couple carrying unbearable loss, when in reality they were counting down the days to freedom. Watching them from that distance made bile rise in my throat, but I held myself steady. To expose myself too soon would rob me of the satisfaction of watching their victory unravel in real time. Instead, I lingered in the shadows of that street, listening to their words carried faintly on the breeze. Josiah spoke of me in the past tense. He told cousins and neighbors that I had been a remarkable woman, that I had worked too hard and deserved to rest. His voice didn't break. His face didn't falter. He believed I was gone, buried by the waves, and that nothing would drag me back. I let him believe it. I let Lydia nod and accept hugs as though she hadn't watched me disappear into the water. The lies they told wrapped around them like fine clothing, but I knew it wouldn't last. Arrogance has a way of exposing itself. That night, instead of knocking on the door of my own home, I returned quietly to the small room I had rented with cash. Alone in the dim light, I stared at the reflection in the mirror, the woman who had been marked for death by her own child and yet still stood. My time would come, but not that night. My revenge needed to be sharp, timed, and undeniable. For 5 days they had celebrated my death. Now, I would choose the exact moment of my return. The 6th day after Josiah pushed me into the sea, I decided it was time. My body still carried the marks of salt and sun, but my spirit burned hotter than ever. I had spent long nights thinking about the perfect moment to reveal myself, and there was no better stage than the gathering my son had arranged to honor a life he believed was already gone. If he wanted to perform grief, then I would be his final audience. The house was crowded when I arrived. Cars lined the street, neighbors and relatives moving in and out of the front door, balancing casseroles, bouquets, and folded hands. Voices carried with that soft hush people reserve for the grieving. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, inhaling deeply, steadying my steps. My palms tingled with anticipation, but I forced myself to move slowly, to own each step. When I opened the door, the air shifted instantly. Conversations faltered, plates froze midair, and eyes locked on me with disbelief. For a moment, silence filled the room like a heavy curtain. Then came the gasps, one after another, rising into a chorus. My family, my friends, my community, they stared as though a ghost had stepped into their presence. And then Josiah saw me. He was standing at the center of the room, a glass in hand, speaking with calm authority, telling some cousin how deeply he was struggling. When his eyes met mine, the words fell dead in his throat. His face drained of color. His jaw went slack, and the glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He staggered back once, twice, and then his body gave way. The sound of him hitting the hardwood sent a tremor through the house. Lydia didn't rush to him. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on me, wide, unblinking, her entire frame stiff with terror. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She clutched her own arms as though holding herself together. In that frozen silence, she betrayed herself. She didn't cry out in relief that I was alive. She didn't whisper a prayer of gratitude. She simply stared, caught between guilt and dread, her complicity written in the stillness of her body. I didn't speak. I didn't accuse. I didn't rage. I only stood there, letting the sight of me alive do what words could never accomplish. The room around us whispered and stirred, people rushing to Josiah's side, others reaching timidly toward me as if to confirm I was flesh and not spirit. Their voices tumbled over one another. Shock, questions, praise, prayers, but I remained still. For me, that moment was enough. I had come back from the water. He tried to bury me in. I had walked into the very house he filled with lies and stood before him as living proof of his betrayal. I didn't need to lift my voice. His fainting, Lydia's silence, and the gasps of everyone around us told the truth louder than I ever could. The very morning after I revealed myself, I made the first call. Not to a friend, not to a relative, but to my attorney. I knew Josiah's fainting spell, his silence, and Lydia's trembling eyes had told the family everything they needed to know. But shock alone could not protect me. If I wanted to end his grasp on my life once and for all, I had to move faster than he ever imagined. I sat in my lawyer's office, my hands steady, my voice sharp. Strip him from everything, I said, every account, every deed, every line in every will. I wasn't asking. I was reclaiming. Within hours, the paperwork began. Calls were made. Banks froze pending access. Deeds were updated. Beneficiary designations were rewritten with fresh ink. Every tie Josiah thought guaranteed him a future was cut cleanly, one document at a time. It wasn't difficult. That was the bitter irony. For years, I had placed his name alongside mine, believing it was love, believing it was trust. But trust is reversible when betrayal is this clear. My lawyer explained how quickly revocations could be filed once I was present and alive. Every signature Josiah expected to inherit from became nothing more than a memory. I will never forget the feeling of those pen strokes, line after line, removing his claim to the homes he never bought, the accounts he never earned, the legacy he had tried to steal. Each page carried a satisfaction words can't capture. He had thought my death would be his beginning. Instead, my survival was his undoing. I changed the locks on my properties, revoked powers of attorney, and canceled every access he had to my finances. I instructed the banks that no inquiry from him or Lydia should be entertained. He would walk in expecting to be treated as heir and leave as nothing more than a stranger. Family members whispered about reconciliation, about forgiveness, about blood being thicker than water. But I reminded myself of that night, of his hands shoving me into the sea, of Lydia's silence as I disappeared under the waves. No amount of pleading could undo that memory. Blood had not protected me. Paper would. By the end of that week, Josiah's name no longer lived beside mine. The strings he clung to for comfort had been severed. He was no longer tied to my fortune, no longer the shadow behind my achievements, no longer positioned to outlive me through my own work. He had taken his shot at ending me, and I answered by ending his future. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was precise, methodical, irreversible. Revenge doesn't always come with fire. It can come with ink and signatures, the quiet sound of a pen that erases entitlement and replaces it with justice. By the time my legal protections were in place, investigators had already begun peeling back the layers of Josiah's so-called grief. What they found was not sorrow, but planning so blatant it might as well have been a confession written on paper. The first clue came from his laptop. Search histories never lie. Investigators uncovered weeks of entries typed in with precision: inheritance after accidental death at sea, how long before missing person declared dead, death without body probate law, Florida. He had studied the process like a student preparing for an exam, building his script for the days after I vanished. The second trail was money. Within 24 hours of my disappearance, Josiah had moved small sums between accounts I had once given him partial access to. Not enough to draw headlines, but enough to show intent. Transfers from savings into joint holdings with Lydia. Inquiries about liquidating property shares he had no right to touch. It was a blueprint of greed, traced in digits and timestamps. Phone records told the rest. He had called my insurance provider the morning after I went missing, his voice steady, inquiring what documents were needed to file a claim. He had reached out to my attorney as if rehearsing sympathy while pressing about contingency arrangements. He even left a voicemail for one of my board colleagues, presenting himself as the heir apparent, already speaking of transition. And then there was the captain. At first, he claimed ignorance. He said he hadn't seen me fall, that the ocean had simply taken me. But under pressure, with documents and bank slips placed before him, his story cracked. Investigators found he had received a deposit days before the cruise, traced directly to an account tied to Josiah. The bribe was clear: keep the yacht moving, delay any emergency response, give the sea enough time to finish what Josiah started. Each piece on its own might have been brushed away as panic or poor judgment. Together, they painted a picture darker than words could capture. He hadn't acted in shock. He hadn't stumbled into bad choices. He had plotted step by step how to erase me. Lydia, too, had left fingerprints on the scheme. Her texts with a friend surfaced. This might be it. Things are finally changing. She knew, and she stood by it. When the investigators laid these findings before me, I sat still, letting the weight of it settle. Every search, every transfer, every call was a confession without words. My son hadn't just betrayed me in the moment. He shoved me into the water. He had betrayed me in the weeks before, in the planning, in the anticipation of my death. And Lydia had stood at his side, eager to collect what was never hers. They had thought the ocean would silence me. Instead, their own actions spoke louder than I ever could. It didn't take long for Lydia to break. The investigators pressed her with the messages they had uncovered, the calls she had made, the details that proved she hadn't just been standing beside Josiah as a grieving wife. She had been standing beside him as an accomplice. At first she denied it, shaking her head, insisting she had no idea what Josiah was planning. But lies collapse quickly when the truth is already in the room. When they read her own words back to her, the silence cut sharper than any blade. This might be it. Things are finally changing. A single line she had typed to a friend just hours before I was pushed into the water. She tried to soften it, tried to explain it away as excitement about a new chapter after the company's sale. But paired with the timing, paired with her behavior on that boat, there was no escape. Finally, under the fluorescent glare of the interrogation room, Lydia folded. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and she admitted what she had hidden. Yes, she knew Josiah had been talking about inheritance. Yes, she had heard him wonder out loud what would happen if I were suddenly gone. Yes, she had stood by silently as his research grew darker, as his anger sharpened, as his plans solidified. Her defense was as pitiful as it was predictable. She claimed she never believed he would go through with it. She said she thought it was just talk, that he was venting frustration, that a son could never truly harm his mother. She sat there, tears streaking her cheeks, insisting she thought it was impossible. But silence is not innocence. Silence on that boat was permission. When Josiah placed his hands on my back and shoved me into the sea, Lydia was there. She saw it, and she chose stillness. She didn't scream. She didn't run to the captain. She didn't throw a rope. She wrapped her arms around herself and let the water swallow me. I made it clear when I heard her confession. Cowardice is not a shield. Standing by while evil unfolds makes you part of it. Lydia wanted the fortune as much as Josiah did. She wanted the comfort, the power, the freedom of money she hadn't earned. Her silence was her signature on the plan. Her tears came too late. By the time she finished speaking, her fate was sealed. She could try to paint herself as the woman who underestimated her husband's cruelty, but the truth was simpler. She underestimated mine, because I survived, and survival made every silent witness guilty. The day I stepped into the courtroom, every eye turned to me. Some saw me as a victim, others as a mother torn in two, but I knew exactly who I was, the woman who had lived to tell the truth. I moved with steady steps, dressed in dark colors, no theatrics, no attempt to look fragile. I had survived the sea. I would survive this. When they called my name, I rose and walked to the witness stand, my hand pressed against the Bible, my oath spoken with a voice that did not tremble. I sat, looked straight ahead, and waited. Josiah sat at the defense table, his eyes cast downward, his suit wrinkled from restless nights. He wouldn't meet my gaze. Lydia sat behind him, her face pale, her hands folded tight in her lap. The prosecutor began, asking me to recount the events of that day on the boat. I told them everything. I spoke of how Josiah had asked me to step closer to the edge, how I had trusted him, how his hands shoved me with force meant to end me. I told them how the waters swallowed me, how I fought for breath, how I saw Lydia standing frozen as the yacht carried them away. My words were calm, steady, each one sharpened by the memory of betrayal. The courtroom listened in silence. No one shifted, no one coughed. Even the air seemed to hold its breath as I described clinging to survival, then being rescued hours later by fishermen who had no idea who I was. I told them how I stayed hidden, gathering strength, watching from the shadows as my son and his wife began arranging a memorial service for a woman still breathing. I described the moment I walked back into that house, the way Josiah's body collapsed when he saw me alive. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I let the truth carry its own weight, and in that room, the truth was heavier than iron. The defense tried to shake me. They asked if perhaps I slipped, if perhaps my mind was clouded from the trauma of the water. They tried to suggest Josiah had been shocked, not malicious. But my voice did not waver. I looked at the jury and said plainly, I know the difference between an accident and murder. My son pushed me. I saw jurors shift in their seats when I said it. Some closed their eyes for a moment, as if the weight of a mother declaring those words pressed on their own hearts. But I felt no guilt. My calm was my weapon. My clarity was the nail in the coffin of Josiah's defense. When I stepped down from the stand, I didn't look back at him. I didn't need to. The power of my testimony wasn't in forcing him to face me. It was in making the world face what he had done. That day in court, my revenge was not rage. It was the simple, unshakable truth spoken in the voice of the woman he had tried to erase. The verdict came down in a silence so heavy it seemed the walls themselves were listening. The jury filed back in, their faces unreadable, their steps measured. I sat in the front row, hands folded, my body still as stone. Josiah sat only feet away from me, his eyes fixed on the table, his jaw clenched tight. Lydia sat behind him, pale, her shoulders hunched as though trying to shrink out of sight. When the foreman spoke, each word rang like a bell. Guilty. Attempted murder in the first degree. The second charge followed, conspiracy. Lydia's name tied to aiding. Her silence no longer an excuse, but a crime. Each verdict landed with a weight that pressed into the air, undeniable, final. I didn't cheer. I didn't weep. I didn't even look at him. Josiah was ordered to serve decades behind bars, not months. Not years measured lightly, but a stretch so long it would swallow his prime and leave him gray and broken when he walked free, if he ever did. Lydia, too, was taken, her charges sealing her fate. She would serve her own time, her complicity branded into her record, her silence turned into chains. I watched as deputies placed shackles on my son's wrists, as the clang of metal echoed through the room. I watched him finally look up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since the stand. They held no rage, no sorrow, only the hollow realization that everything he had wanted had slipped beyond his reach. Lydia lowered her head, tears streaking her cheeks, as she was led away. Around us, the room stirred with murmurs, family members sighing, neighbors whispering, reporters scribbling, but I remained still. I had no need to add to the noise. The sight before me was enough. Josiah in chains, Lydia disgraced, their ambitions crumbled to dust. That day, the courtroom became the stage for their downfall. They had plotted my end on the water, but here on solid ground, the law had written theirs. The sentencing was not the end. It was only the beginning of Josiah's fall. In the days that followed, I watched everything he thought he had secured unravel piece by piece, stripped away like old paint from a crumbling wall. The very life of comfort he imagined was waiting for him dissolved into nothing. The first to go were the cars, those shiny machines he loved to parade through the neighborhood, symbols of a wealth he hadn't earned, were repossessed one after another. I saw them carried off on flatbeds, their engines silent, their chrome catching the sunlight one last time before disappearing down the street. Neighbors stood at their windows, watching the spectacle, whispering about how quickly privilege can vanish when it's built on sand. Then came the properties, the homes with his name attached in trust, the investment condos he bragged about to friends, all of them untangled, pulled from his reach, and folded back into my hands or liquidated under court orders. The keys he once jangled so confidently were gone. The doors he had claimed now locked against him. His accounts, once flush with transfers he made in the arrogance of believing me dead, froze into emptiness. Every dollar he moved illegally was clawed back. Every inquiry he made during those 5 days of false mourning cataloged as evidence. What he thought was his new fortune became proof of his greed, documented line by line. And then there was the weight of shame. For years, Josiah had carried himself as my son, the heir of grace, the one destined to inherit everything I had fought for. But after the trial, his name was no longer met with respect. It was met with whispers. Friends vanished. Associates cut ties. The community that once nodded at him as though he were royalty now crossed the street when he passed in chains. Lydia fared no better. She walked out of the courthouse that day in disgrace. Her carefully chosen outfits, her painted smile, her posture of importance, all stripped as quickly as the title of wife of a successful heir. She had stood silent when I was pushed, and now the world stood silent when she needed support. She was marked, not by bruises, but by shame, the kind that lingers longer than prison walls. I didn't gloat. I didn't clap my hands in victory. I simply observed. Each possession taken, each title erased, each relationship severed was justice unfolding in slow motion. He had tried to bury me, but in the end, he buried himself. In the quiet that followed the trial, I turned my attention back to what had always been mine, the life I had built through work, sacrifice, and faith. But this time, I carried no illusions. Blood had betrayed me. The son I once believed would carry my legacy forward had proven unworthy of even holding its shadow. If I wanted my fortune to matter, I had to place it where loyalty was proven, not assumed. I sat with my attorney again, not to undo the damage Josiah had caused that had already been erased, but to draw a new blueprint, one that safeguarded every dollar, every property, every piece of what I had worked for. I rewrote my estate plan from top to bottom. The first order of business was simple. Josiah's name would never again appear beside mine. No appeal, no loophole, no chance of his release decades from now allowing him to reach back into my affairs. The law would not bend in his favor. Instead, I directed my resources to places that carried meaning. Scholarships for young women determined to build their own futures. Endowments for community centers where children like Josiah once could find guidance and discipline without entitlement poisoning their steps. Portions of my estate were placed in trusts for relatives who had stood by me, people who had proven their loyalty when my own child had abandoned it. I streamlined my holdings too. Properties I had once kept under Josiah's name were sold. The funds consolidated and protected in ironclad accounts. Every lawyer, every banker understood my instructions clearly. Safeguard this legacy against betrayal. Build walls higher than greed can climb. In those long sessions, I discovered something unexpected. Rebuilding my estate wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming peace. For so long, I had told myself my success was for my son. That belief had blinded me to his envy, his resentment, his hunger for what he hadn't earned. Now, freed from that illusion, I saw my wealth differently. It wasn't about inheritance. It was about intention. I no longer built for family loyalty. I built for clarity, for dignity, for the assurance that when I left this world, my name would be tied not to scandal, but to survival, not to betrayal, but to impact. That clarity was worth more than any figure written on paper. Looking back, what stands out to me most is not the shove, not the water, not even the days I spent hidden away gathering strength. It's the cost Josiah paid for his greed. He thought he was reaching for wealth, but what he really seized was ruin. Greed never gives what it promises. It takes more than money. It strips away dignity. It tears apart family. It shackles freedom. Josiah lost all three. The boy I once cradled in my arms had grown into a man who chose money over his mother's life. And in that choice, he didn't just betray me. He destroyed himself. The dignity he once carried as my son evaporated the moment he was dragged out of that courtroom in chains. Family, the very bloodline he thought entitled him to fortune, became the reason for his shame. And freedom, the prize he valued most, was swallowed whole by prison walls. Lydia, too, bore the price. Her silence, her complicity, cost her everything she thought she had gained by standing at his side. She walked into the courthouse as a wife expecting to inherit a fortune, and she walked out disgraced, her name tied forever to cowardice and crime. My survival was justice, not the kind that relies on luck or miracle, but the kind that proves patience is stronger than panic. People often think revenge means shouting, fighting, or striking back with the same violence that was used against you. But what I learned is that sometimes the greatest revenge is patience, the ability to stand, to wait, and to let the guilty hang themselves with the rope they spun. Josiah thought he was clever, but every call he made, every search he typed, every lie he told was another knot tightening around him. The price of greed is steep. It doesn't only bankrupt the pockets, it bankrupts the soul. Josiah traded everything for an inheritance he would never touch. And in the end, I didn't have to lift a hand to take it from him. He took it from himself. I have carried many titles in my life: businesswoman, mother, survivor. But the one that means the most to me is this: I am the woman who lived to tell my own story. My son tried to end me, to erase me with one push, to claim everything I built as though my blood, sweat, and sacrifice meant nothing. But he failed. And because he failed, I hold the last word. I think often about how close I came to silence, how easily the sea could have taken me. But survival is more than breath. It is strategy. It is patience. It is knowing when to stand still and let the truth reveal itself. My revenge was never rage. It wasn't in shouting or striking back with the same hands that betrayed me. My revenge was survival. My revenge was strategy. My revenge was foresight. And in the end, those three things cut deeper than any blade. They stripped Josiah of the future he thought was his. They stripped Lydia of the comfort she thought she had secured. They left me not only alive, but stronger, clearer, untouchable. So I will say it once more as the closing of my journey. I sold my company for $40 million and decided to celebrate with my son and his wife on a boat cruise. At the middle of the ride, my son pushed me into the water to die, but I survived. 5 days later, when he saw me, he fainted. Those are not just words. That is the truth of my life. My son's betrayal gave me pain, but it also gave me something far more powerful, the final word.